Yeah, this is our 20th meeting. So
Yes, sir.
it seems like now, if we don't stop now, I think it will continue. I think we'll let's see when we reach 52. That will be our first year. Let's see.
Yeah. So, but the journey so far has been good. At least I had a lot of insights. The thought process is definitely change, and the amount of confidence in writing investigations or counseling definitely for me definitely made a difference.
And that was the whole purpose of discussion like this, right? That you get out of the theory mindset and kind of just understand the practical way of doing things, which all of us do differently. And hopefully that will just make us a better thinker whenever we are looking at the patient.
Yeah. So just to complete, the other day had a call from MIC2 pulmonology case. I think I discussed this case, na? COPD, atrial flutter with variable
Yes,
block.
yes, yes.
So we had the discussion of ibutlide and all.
Yeah.
Agri was mentioning that flutter ibutlide
Mm,
is a drug, and we gave
mm.
ibutlide. So a lot of those points came into surfaced from the subconscious memory.
Right.
So you could more confidently prescribe.
So that Abutilide, your Abutilide prescription came directly from the meeting, huh?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it was there when CN used to be there, but because you're not prescribing that frequently, na, it goes out
Right,
of your memory
right, exactly.
and then it resurfaced back.
Yeah. So what did you do after that? Did you start loading him with amiodarone?
Yeah, I gave him amiodarone. His currently rates are controlled, but he's still in flutter.
Still in flutter. Okay.
Mm.
So yeah, maybe we can try again after like 2 weeks or a month or something like that.
Yeah. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's weekly huddle. Most of them are a regular audience or previously they have attended, but just for the sake of completion, so this huddle is a program which is like a casual audio session, like the same bedside discussion or a coffee table discussion that we do to discuss about cases and how do you manage and knowing the practice patterns. It's like putting the guidelines into practice and modifying is what is the essence of this weekly huddle. So every session, every week, we discuss clinical and non-clinical topic, and we take inputs from one of the guests that we invite, and equally we take opinions and comments from the audience that we join. So today we to the 20th session that we are discussing about uh, procoagulant states or prothrombotic conditions. And we have two guests today to discuss about the same topic. I welcome Dr. A. Krishna Prasad, who is a professor of hematology and medicine in the Department of Medicine, Nizam's Institute of Medical Sciences. I also happen to be his student. We also had invited Dr. Shanti Naidu, who is head of the laboratory medicine at Air Hospitals. Unfortunately, she hasn't joined yet. Probably there is some issue from her end. We hope that she joins us. So we'll start our discussion. So normally we bring up a case. So I would present the case which I had encountered recently, and myself and my colleague Dr. Anup were discussing this case. So we thought we will discuss the same case in the huddle. So Anup, so I would be telling that discussing that about that patient, and then we'll take your comments, and then we'll take opinion of the others who are there. So this patient is a 42-year male, hypertensive, no other risk factors, has his own setup of water bottles business, comes with sudden onset pain in the right lower limb, pain and swelling in the right lower limb. He was came to hospital. Clinical diagnosis of a deep vein thrombosis was made. Ultrasound shows a deep vein thrombosis of the saphenofemoral vein extending into the popliteal vein, and he was having all the features of an acute right lower limb deep vein thrombosis. Past history, he had cortical sinus venous thrombosis diagnosed in 2006 in Nizam's Institute of Medical Sciences when he presented with a sudden loss of consciousness. So he had a fall, and when he was went to NIMS, he was diagnosed to be having cortical sinus venous thrombosis, and that is when he was suspected to be having a procoagulant condition. He was started on oral anticoagulation and was on follow-up. Of course, the therapy was erratic and he was not compliant with the drugs. 1 year he was taking anti-epileptic and anticoagulants, and because the therapy was or the compliance was an issue, he had a second episode of seizures or the loss of consciousness again after 1 year, and he had a diagnosis of same cortical sinus venous thrombosis, with two episodes occurring within a span of 1 year. The suspicion of a procoagulant state was higher, and this time he gets the workup done. And in the panel of tests it was done, protein C was found to be deficient, and he was diagnosed or labeled as a protein C deficiency, and he was advised to take oral anticoagulations along with anti-epileptics. He used them for approximately almost 10 years, the anticoagulants and anti-epileptics, and was with follow-up for quite some time with the neurology department in Nizams. And then he lost follow-up, and equally he stopped anticoagulants. Also, and his antihypertensive therapy was also erratic, and now he presents now to Care Hospital with acute right lower limb DVT. So the question to me is, Anup, or what we had discussion is whether this patient really has a protein C deficiency, and how do we manage him further, and what should be the next step in so-called family screening to prevent the prothrombotic events in the other members of family. So Anup, what would how would you approach this case for someone who seems to be having a prothrombotic condition?
So, Praneeth, I remember we had this discussion in the cath lab. So I'm just going to continue or repeat what I said at that time. And then just for the sake of discussion, we'll just maintain the theme as it is, and we'll let other people opine. So I know this case, so I will fill in whatever questions I had. So one of the question is that this DVT was unprovoked, which I know because you told me that history at the time, that he wasn't bedridden, there was no any injury, there was nothing. So it was an unprovoked DVT. And then in the past, he had 2 episodes of thrombotic event. So he certainly has got some sort of prothrombotic milieu. Whether it is protein C or not, that is a point of debate. But he seems to have some sort of prothrombotic milieu, which qualifies him for lifelong anticoagulation. Now, as far as the diagnosis of protein C deficiency is made, this is what I recollected from my residency days, where in US where I got trained, if you send a thrombotic panel in a patient who has an active thrombosis or who are admitted, the laboratory will not accept that sample, because the whole idea was that the levels
Anup, I'm not able to hear you. Are others able to hear Anup, or is it me?
Okay, Praneeth, are you able to hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, were you able to hear what I was saying in the last few minutes?
Of residency and the panel getting rejected.
Yeah. Okay.
Potency estimation in acute setting.
Right. Perfect. So the idea here was that was my memory, that in the admitted setup, the only test you could qualify to do was the genetic testing, like a factor V Leiden mutation or antithrombin 3 mutations, because those tests are not, they won't change based upon whether you are admitted or not, whether you have an acute episode or not. So if this protein C deficiency that your patient is diagnosed with, if those tests were done at the time when he was admitted, which is most commonly when tests are done, then I question the validity of that diagnosis, whether the patient truly has protein C deficiency or not. The question that you asked is, how do you test the family members? That is very prudent, because only when we know what index case has a diagnosis, then we can use that diagnostic tool, in my opinion, to the other family members. So in your patient, he needs anticoagulation. As far as therapy is concerned, I think he should be retested at this admission for genetic testing like factor V Leiden and antithrombin 3, and later on with protein C, S, and all the other levels that we discussed, and re-evaluate what true diagnosis he has. And once we have that diagnosis, then we can screen the family member. That is what we discussed, Praneeth. This is not new for you, but to
Yes.
open up the discussion to everybody else, and then you can also tell us what happened to your patient later on.
Yeah.
That is
So
what I have.
yeah. So before I take up comments from our guest today, Dr. Krishna Prasad, does anybody else in the audience have any other questions, or what would be their approach of or any thought process of this case? Anyone has any comments so far? I think nobody is.
Can I come
Yeah.
in? Good evening.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, good evening. I'm Prashant here. Yeah, I had a similar case. In fact, it was a 11-year-old girl. Actually, it was referred to me by an orthopedician. She had like lower limb pain after she was actively involved in Zumba classes and all. But since the pain didn't subside after giving analgesics, they somehow, the orthopedician felt that there could be some venous involvement. So he had referred to me, and it was found that she had extensive DVT later. So then, when I got her evaluated, she had again protein C mutation and deficiency. So, it's not that uncommon when we come across such cases. So eventually, since she was reasonably well built for her age and she weighed almost around 60-65 kgs. In fact, she was quite obese, and for her contemporaries, she was obese, and also her height was almost like an adult. So unfortunately, she couldn't tolerate any of the conventional oral anticoagulants in subsequently. So I had to put her on Rivaroxaban 15 mg, even though there are not many guidelines or any articles supporting usage of them in children. But since she was well built and reasonably what you call had a reasonable weight, so we took a chance and put her. And since last 1.5 year after that, she is doing well. Obviously, with all the precautions and screenings that she needs to take have been told to her, and also I had involved a hematologist also in the treatment. So this is what I just want to comment.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your case. So I will come to our guest today. So Krishna Prasad sir, I hope you heard the story. So what do you think about diagnosing this patient as having protein C deficiency, and what Dr. Anup was suggesting, that the deficiency of protein C being or the testing is inaccurate in an acute setting? What is your take on it? How do we approach these cases, and how do we work upon the so-called suspected procoagulant state?
Okay, thank you, Praneeth. As Anup has already said, in acute setting, the protein C, protein S, and all these things are unnecessary. They will confuse us, because in acute setting already there is thrombosis, and protein C and S are getting consumed. So it won't tell us anything. It is only an acute setting. In acute setting, our aim is to treat it. Suppose if the patient is giving some first time coming to us, the diagnosis was not yet settled. Having come to a conclusion, it is a thrombotics, prothrombotics. Anyway, you are starting anticoagulant. That is one thing. our clinical approach is always first have the hemogram and a coagulation profile. What I mean, hemogram and coagulation profile, these two are the basic investigations which will give us a clue regarding the underlying problem in the patient. How, what are the clues? I will tell you one by one. Suppose if we are doing while the patient is not on any treatment, better, first thing. Hemogram, anyway, that there won't be much problem. If you see the hemogram report, a naive patient and a hemogram report who is not on treatment, definitely that will give a good clue to us. That is something like see the RBC, see the WBC, and see the platelet. If the all three cell lines are increased, or at least one of the three, it goes with myeloproliferative neoplasm. So the immediate workup is towards myeloproliferative neoplasm, which entity and how to document it and how to do the treatment and all those things. Okay. Suppose if there is anemia, the RBC are microcytic, and you have seen an iron deficiency, that means a vascular thrombosis and an iron deficiency anemia. PNH will come into differential diagnosis. Suppose if there is anemia but macrocytic RBC and you have confirmed B12 and folate deficiency, hyperhomocystinemia will come into differential diagnosis. That is the most probable clinical possibility. Suppose if there is anemia but normocytic, see the peripheral smear. If there is a sickling, is a sickle cell disease, because of this clogging, thrombosis will occur in hypoxic states. And suppose if all the three cell lines are decreased, like anemia, leukopenia, and thrombocytopenia, first thing is always please suspect PNH. Next thing is, suppose in pancytopenia, if RBC are macrocytic, please consider megaloblastic anemia and homocystinemia. Megaloblastic anemia presents only as macrocytic anemia sometimes, or sometimes it is pancytopenia with macrocytic RBC. And another condition is, if there is anemia, leukopenia, and thrombocytopenia or in combinations, that is the hematological criteria for SLE. If the SLE is a possibility, there may be a superadded anticardiolipin antibody syndrome, which predisposes this patient for thrombosis. And sometimes, if you can see the peripheral smear, a pancytopenia and a teardrop cells, it goes with myeloproliferative neoplasm. Once again.
Hello.
Hello, hello. Yes. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Audible, sir. We are following you.
Right, right.
Sure.
There is one more
Okay.
entity. There is pancytopenia.
Okay. Do you have the link with you, na?
Sir,
Where?
sir.
Okay. What is the error or what is
Crosstalk, sir. Anup?
Yeah.
Hello, Anup, can you mute yourself? Yeah, thank you. Sir, please go ahead.
Right. One more thing is, sometimes there will be pancytopenia. Thrombosis is there always background. A pancytopenia, and you have done a bone marrow, and it is hypoplastic. Please consider a possibility of a PNH clone existing in it, which is responsible for this thrombosis. Another thing is, suppose there is only thrombocytopenia and a thrombosis. You know differential diagnosis very well. One of the thing is anti-APLA. And one more thing is, if there is anemia, the peripheral smear is showing us a Rolex formation and an autoagglutination, it is a hyperviscosity syndrome. And tops the list is multiple myeloma. And if there is anemia and you have proved a hemolysis proving by your bilirubin, unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia, and decreased globin, and an increased LDH, and a Coombs positivity. All these things are there. That means this patient is having autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Autoimmune hemolytic anemias are procoagulant conditions. people are prone to have vascular thrombosis. So there are so many hematological conditions that will come into this differential diagnosis. If you can have, if you can see that hemogram report, naive report. If you have already interfered and patient is taking so many drugs and there is interference, that will always confuse us. Otherwise, a baseline hemogram will definitely give us a clue for the underlying clinical condition. So that is one test. Another test is what we regularly do is for any patient of this kind is coagulation profile. Coagulation profile means what I mean actually, prothrombin PT, APTT, TT and fibrinogen. These are the 4 parameters we will be looking at. In this, if the APTT is prolonged by more than 7 seconds, there is a possibility of anti-APLA, that is antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. Sometimes the APTT is, the test value is less than the control value. That means the patient's blood is clotting at a faster rate than the control. That is the situation where you have to suspect an underlying hyperfactoremia, like factor 8 hyperconcentration or factor 9 hyperconcentration. Rare condition is only, I have read many things, but I have not seen any patient like that. One more entity is, suppose if the PT is prolonged, APTT is prolonged, and TT is prolonged, automatically we suspect hypofibrinogenemia, but the fibrinogen level will be normal. This is the constellation for dysfibrinogenemia. That means the fibrinogen is dysfunctional, but these people are prone for vascular thrombosis. And one more thing is, suppose if the fibrinogen is high, anyway, is well aware, you are well aware, that is hyperfibrinogenemia, which is once again associated with vascular thrombosis. So all these things, these 2 basic tests when the patient is not on treatment. Suppose you have already started an anticoagulation, it is very difficult to come to a conclusion with coagulation profile. It will interfere with. And regarding the protein C, protein S, antithrombin 3, APC resistant, prothrombin gene mutation, MTFR, that is methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase gene mutation, all these things are there. But these things has to be done when hemogram is normal and a coagulation profile is normal. This situation generally very difficult. That's why in acute situation, always please go ahead with your management. Manage for 6 months, document the recanalization, and if condition permits, stop the anticoagulation, give a gap of 2 weeks. After that, start this workup. Right? That's why the protein C test, whatever that was reported in the report, in the indexed case, we don't know when exactly that test was done. That's why it is very difficult to tell it is protein C really deficient or not. One more thing is, if this protein S, protein C, and factor V Leiden, all these things are, these mutations are sometimes type 1, sometimes type 2, sometimes type 3. Type 1 is a qualitative deficiency. Type 2 is quantitative deficiency. Quantitative deficiency is very easy because in the laboratory you will see the protein C deficiency value. But quantitatively it is normal, but qualitatively it is not functioning well. That is type 1. And sometimes these 2 are mixed. That is type 3. So that's why coming to a diagnosis 100% is very difficult, and we have to have a lab which is very, very sophisticated. That's why in hematology forums, what they say is, whatever it is, if the patient is less than 40 years, there is a recurrent thrombocytic with thrombotic events, thrombosis while on anticoagulation therapy, and a life-threatening situation, life-threatening complication like pulmonary thromboembolism or something like that, you have to have an anticoagulation lifelong, whatever may be the underlying condition. Okay, this is the clinical approach what we follow at Nizams. Anyway, Pranit is well aware of these things, and he wanted me to give those algorithm. That's why just I am telling you these things. And anyway, treatment is you are all well aware, and you are all managing cases. That is not a problem at all. But regarding the estimation and all those things, Shanti Naidu may be a better person for this protein C, protein S, because antithrombin 3 estimations and APC, because it is only a pure laboratory. We don't know how much sophistication laboratory is required, whether we are having those sophisticated machinery and all. And probably a laboratory person is a better person. Only we have, as a clinician, just I'll interpret that value. That is my role. Okay. Is it clear from my side?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. That was, in fact, a very elaborate and systemic approach of approaching a case. Thank you for refreshing my memory, sir. It's been quite some time. So the way you elaborated the method, I mean, the methodology is amazing, sir. I think we are joined by Dr. Shanti Naidu.
Okay, good. It is better to hear from her.
Yes. Madam, am I audible?
Yes, Pranit.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you
So
hear
thank you for
me?
joining.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Loud and clear. Loud
I'm
and
sorry
clear.
I'm late. I had a problem with my phone. Okay.
Not an issue, madam. We are glad that you joined. So just to get you into the loop, we started with the case which we discussed with you the other day. Myself and Anup, we came into your chamber and we discussed. So we were started with that case, and we asked Dr. Krishna Prasad to tell us how to approach a case. So he told us about starting with a hemogram followed by a coagulation profile. So so you can share us what you told us of how to approach. You probably can start with about that protein C deficiency, its role, and how do we approach, or how would you tell us to send which parameter and when, and how to send the parameters. You please highlight us on those aspects.
Yeah. Thank you. The first dictum is never investigate the patient during an acute illness. But that is something we always do, though we know that we shouldn't do it. It's okay in literature that they do it because they can afford to do it the second time after the patient is discharged and they want to know an acute condition. But in a setting like ours, where finance is a real problem, to do it twice or thrice is very difficult. So my first understanding is that it is better that we do not do a workup during an acute phase of illness. Literature states that we should at least wait for 3 months. And if you're doing it during an acute phase of illness, you should repeat it after 3 to 6 months. That is the first thing which at least 90% of us do not follow for various reasons. The second thing is the patient never receives history. The history and the clinical history for the lab is of utmost importance. If it is a young thrombotic, then doing certain genetic tests becomes mandatory. If it is an elderly man, say more than 50, 60 years, the genetic tests do not actually play a role unless he has had a repeated thrombotic episode. Now, coming to what should we do, it is always better to do it when the patient is not receiving an anticoagulant. But sometimes that is not possible, or many times it's not possible. At least do not look at protein C, protein S when patient is on an oral anticoagulant, because these are all vitamin K dependent factors working that way. Can you do it on heparin? Yes. If the patient is on oral anticoagulant, we say put the patient on heparin. But if you're looking at an APLA, looking for inhibitors, then you're using conventional heparin, please inform the lab, because there are different ways how the lab works on it. Now, when I have said these things, I think clinicians should understand that clinical history and family history is absolutely important. If there is a family history of thrombosis, then investigating the genetic factors is also important, like factor V Leiden, prothrombin 2 gene, MTHFR for homocysteine, most commonly the is in literature that we hardly see many factor V ladens, or we have not been seeing that higher percentage because we did not have the facility for many years. Now, over the past 10, 15 years, we do have the facility to work it up, but still the main centers that have reported this are PGI Chandigarh and CMC Vellore, where it is well documented, and it is much less than 1%, especially prothrombin 2 gene it's in decimal figure percentages, whereas factor V laden, yes, is slightly more, maybe because of the facilities and the know-how now. Now, the approach would be how the ideal approach in the Western countries is they first do a genetic testing. That is, they look for factor V laden, they look for prothrombin 2 gene, and they look for MTHFR. But since these tests are very expensive in our country, we do it the other way. We look at protein C, protein S, antithrombin 3, and the APLA. And then according to the history, we would ask for a factor V laden, very rarely a prothrombin 2 gene workup. And yes, homocysteine, yesteryears, say about in the 90s, it's much in vogue that we do homocysteine. But somehow along the way, it lost its importance in one of the main factors of being causative of a thrombus. But when we look at things now, maybe the facilities to do homocysteine is more sensitive and accurate, we do see a lot of young thrombotics with high homocysteine levels. Then the next question is, are they vegetarians? What is the B12 level? Now, this sort of workup never happens. It gives the lab a problem, it gives the clinician a problem, and of course, it gives the patient a problem. When you do homocysteine, please see that you have done a B12. Otherwise, there is no use thinking that homocysteine is a cause. And many of them are vegetarians, will have low B12s. And therefore, in the cycle of the metabolism, it will be a problem to assess. So this is how we approach. So the approach would be looking at a screen profile, which would consist, if necessary, of PT, APTT, and fibrinogen, which is not normally done, and protein C, protein S, AT3, antithrombin 3, and looking at APLA, which will include about 5 tests. But the approach working towards APLA would be depending a lot on the clinical history. Now, there are different programs, at least in our hospital, where we have profiles. We say a stroke profile, we say a thrombotic profile, we say a thrombotic profile with B12 and homocysteine. So clinical importance being given to the lab makes the lab, facilitates the lab in giving a decision on how to approach. Now, these are expensive tests and they cannot be just run off the mill like other tests on a daily basis. They are done in a weekly once or twice, whatever the load and the finances of the lab may be. So this is how we approach it. And I still think that we should never investigate a patient in an acute phase. If you have to for various reasons, or the patient can afford it, it would be ideal to work up the patient 3 months after it and look at the anticoagulation that the patient is on while testing. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you for giving us that insight, madam. So to complete the story of the patient which I had, so we approached Dr. Madam for the same reason, and for his deep vein thrombosis, the patient was initiated on unfractionated heparin as a therapy, and the same discussion came in where the importance of or the labeling the patient as protein C deficiency was of question. And when we approached madam, so the suggestion was that we can repeat the test, the same hesitancy of doing a workup on the acute setting. But the suggestion which was came from Dr. Shanti Naidu was to, because the patient was not on oral anticoagulants, to give blood sample with the patient on heparin, knowing that the patient was on unfractionated heparin, and the procoagulant panel workup was done, with genetic testing being kept as a follow-up investigations. So this patient procoagulant profile was sent, and all the panel of tests were essentially normal. That is, the protein C, protein S were normal, antithrombin levels were also normal, and ANA was also negative. And coming to the point of Dr. Krishna Prasad sir was also it was normal. Like the hemogram was all the cell lines were normal, and even the peripheral smear reported it to be uh, normocytic normochromic with no abnormal cells in the peripheral smear. I did not order a coagulation profile for this patient, sir. So I approached madam for asking her, and this is the procoagulant workup that we did. So patient was discharged with oral anticoagulants and he's on follow-up. We advised him to undergo genetic testing later, and he is on follow-up. We will be getting done the genetic test, which the 3 gene mutations will be tested, and once they will be tested, we will be knowing whether they really have any procoagulant situation, and equally the family screening and all will be done. So
Something, Pranit, now? Can I just say
Yes.
something now?
yes, ma'am.
Yeah, there was one more point which I want to add is please do not do these workups as piecemeal. I see a lot of patients who come to us with reports of protein C done on one date, protein S or free protein S done on another date. And protein S is very, very difficult to do by any method, whether it be automated or whether it be a ELISA methodology. It has its lot of pitfalls. So you send it to a lab which has experience. And please do not break up like one in month of January, you'll do protein C. Then when the patient comes again, you do protein S. Now, another factor is factor 8. Though it is not very common, but we do see gross elevations of factor 8 causing thrombosis. Usually they are about more than 800 units. We have seen it in a family in Saudi who live in Saudi. Actually, they are from here. So getting the place of their nativity, etc., also is slightly important. Family history is absolutely important. And the way you would approach a patient to work up depends on many of these factors: epidemiological, family, age. Age is very important. Young stroke, you have to investigate thoroughly. Thrombosis with say 50, 60 years, the approach is entirely different. And yes, no acute testing. If done in an acute phase, please repeat. That's all I wanted to say.
So Krishna Prasad sir, do you have anything to add or modify or suggest, sir?
No, what madam has said 100% right. That is the protocol. As protein C, suppose if it is normal, there is a problem, that is ABC resistance. C is good, but it is not getting influencing the factor 5. That means sometimes that factor 5, the leaden is heterozygotic defect. There may be homozygotic defect also. That's why a mutation analysis and the estimation entirely a laboratory workup. Madam is a better person. Please follow whatever she says.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. So we'll open up to audience. So audience, do you have any questions regarding this care or any other questions in general to our guest tonight? Anyone?
Okay, it's me again. One of the most important things in these testings is how you collect the sample. Pre-analytical errors cause a lot of problems in the lab, and please talk to any lab before you send out the sample. The temperature while you're transporting, the temperature where they will store, what is the centrifugation speed, is there a specific centrifuge for these tests with a specific speed other than what they use for routine lab parameters. So all these are very important. I'm not saying send it to my lab. There are many labs which do it, but just see that this sort of homework is done before you send it out to that lab.
Sometimes we'll end up with no clue at all. That may be a cause for this qualitative defects. Type 1 qualitative defects of either protein S or C or this factor V Leiden. That's why it's very difficult to come to a reasonable pinpointed diagnosis most of the times. We have to manage the case, that's all.
So, madam, I have a follow-up question for whatever you said. So, yes, I agree that a good lab is something which is necessary. And someone, an institute where a hematology department is there, or where someone like you is there, it makes it easy. But how do we know that the lab has the enough capability to test, and how do we know as a clinician, and what should we talk to the lab personnel to get the best out of the investigations?
Accredited laboratories.
Necessarily, but I would like to say that before you send out these samples, I'm sure by word of mouth you will know which labs do what. You will talk to your colleagues all over. And sometimes when we are in institutes, we have no choice but to send it to the lab in our own institute. But I think it is necessary, if you have a lot of such cases, to see that the lab builds up a good environment to work on it. Otherwise, you be sure that every city has at least 2-3 hospitals. And for God's sake, do not send these samples to referral labs, because the way they transport, the time it takes, the way they store, we have no control over. We don't have any control over when the nursing station draws the sample. So let alone when it goes elsewhere. So all these are problems. Ideally, whichever city or place you are in, you should send it to the best lab. By word of mouth, you will know which lab does that. I think that's the best way to go. And I think people who really work with passion on this will tell you, I am sorry, I can't do it. You send it to the other lab. That's the only thing I can say. If it is affordable, you tell the patient to come back when they come for follow-up and to get it done in a good lab. We have a lot of samples from Vijayawada, Visakhapatnam, and they do really follow what instructions we give them. They catch a bus in the night, they draw the sample, they catch a bus in the night, at 4 o'clock in the morning, they deliver it to us. So I think nowadays it is not difficult to maintain the pre-analytical protocols at all. It is a mindset.
So there are in the chat box there is some question, ma'am. Let me read it. So just a second. So there is one question: can we diagnose protein C S deficiency when on anticoagulants? I think you answered it, but for the sake of completion, can you say it again?
Not when the patient is on oral anticoagulant. No, definitely no.
CNS are also vitamin K dependent. They are also vitamin K dependent.
Yes, so you cannot check for protein C. And ideally, why would you want to do an isolated protein C? Is it more common? And then if we don't have liver function test to say whether the liver is okay or not. So I think a clinical understanding as a whole, just because you see an episode of thrombosis and you shoot out, do protein C. That's what I said. Don't do piecemeal testing. It doesn't work in the long run.
Yeah.
And not well.
Laboratory person. Always that works well.
Yeah. There has to be crosstalk.
Yeah. Anup, can you mute others who are there? I think some ads key has been opened. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
I had a question actually.
Okay. Thank you. Please ask.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. Sir, ma'am was telling about pre-analytical measures that are supposed to be taken. Ma'am, can you tell us like few basic things while collecting sample? What should we do? How should we be careful about? And any time duration is there for the sample? Even with our nursing stations, we collect samples early, and by the time it reaches lab reception, it takes quite a long time. So, what are the basic things that we need to be careful of, ma'am?
First and foremost, we are in an era, I think, when we should not do syringe and needle sampling. We syringe and needle sampling even now at our nursing stations. The best way to do sampling now, safety, otherwise, etc., would be to do a closed system where we use vacutainer needles and the blood directly flows into the vacutainer. Because the vacuum makes you collect the sample accurately. What do you mean? What do I mean by accurately? Because the dilution of the anticoagulant to the blood is one of the main features of coagulation testing. And that is that it has to be 9 parts of blood to 1 part of citrate. And most of the vacutainers, whatever the volume may be of the vacutainer that is mentioned on the tube, it will always be in this dilution. If this dilution is changed, especially for coagulation testing, you be sure that there will be errors. There is only a very minute percentage of variation that can occur. So the sampling has to be accurate. And it should never be what should I say, a puncture that is, you don't find the vein, then you start moving the needle and then you double puncture or you look for a vein at another site nearby. These things are not done. It has to be an absolute clean puncture. The tubing, the volume, and what happens when you do a needle and the syringe thing is you open the cap, and the purpose of us buying a vacuum tube is lost, and vacuum tubes are costly. So that fundamental basic thing is not set right after many years, even now in our hospital. It has to be transported in ice, in an ice pack, which maintains 2 to 8. It comes to the lab. We don't do all these special tests on a daily basis. So we centrifuge at a specific speed, which gives us, because in coagulation testing and in platelet function testing, the type of plasma we use is different. In coagulation testing, we say you use platelet poor plasma. In platelet function testing, we use platelet rich plasma. So the platelet poor plasma has to have a platelet count. After we spin the sample, the plasma should have less than 10,000 platelets, and it should be the otherwise in the others type of sampling. So this speed criteria and all has to be very clearly understood. Now, what happens is you please see that samples are transported at least within half an hour. Within half an hour for these tests, so that they're not lying on the table, and the summers in our country are not easy to deal with. So there will be changes. So this, and we have taken umpteen classes for nursing staff on how to do this. But I think the change of staff, everything, this has to be more frequently done. And we should visit the lab once in a way to see how to sample. And what with the authorities that be and the senior consultants, I think we should bring closed sampling even in the wards. I presume all sitting here are from only. Yeah. All people.
There are
in
no, madam. We have stories.
Okay, but I'm just giving an example. I'm giving just an example because I think this is the same story in most of the hospitals.
Yeah.
Ma'am, one more question. Sir, I had one more question for ma'am. Ma'am, for right now, COVID patients, we are doing C profile, which has a D-dimer. So we see a lot of variation in the values of the same patient on daily basis, ma'am. Is it because of the sampling error, or what could it be,
It is
ma'am?
not because of the sampling error, ma'am. We are also seeing it. And we actually burnt our fingers because we were the early stages, we were getting in thousands, and these are numericals we have never seen in our life, never seen in literature. 60,000, 90,000. Some of them are true, but what happens is, at least my understanding is, we started looking at the samples. The same patient in the morning, the same patient had a sample drawn in the afternoon, and the same patient had a sample drawn in the evening. If you see that sample, it is so viscous. Actually, when we take a clear plasma in the morning, if we take a plasma for any coagulation test, the plasma is absolutely clear. It is straw colored. It is not at all viscous or lipemic, because a fasting sample, of course, won't be lipemic unless they have other causes. Now, if you take the sample where we are reporting more than, say, 10,000, 12,000, the sample is so viscous. Are we having a drug interference? I really don't know. This I've been asking my physicians because I am also frightened to sign out such reports. We there is a lot of difference in the sample itself. So I think it is not a sampling error. It is an error that is happening because of drug which may interfere and cause this, but they will tell you we are just giving Dexa, we are just giving Remdesivir, this is on the other arm. This, a full truthful answer I cannot give you, but we are seeing it in all the hospitals all over the country, even in literature. And what happens is because the sample is so viscous, we have to do the maintenance of the instrument more regularly. We have daily and weekly maintenance for each instrument. But when we started seeing this, our maintenance frequency has increased during the day and during the week, and we're not having so many problems. So maybe there is a carryover of this viscous sample hanging on to the tubings, and this is interfering to some extent, not to a very large extent. But I still feel that in my experience of these 6 months, there is some drug interference. And I also feel that there must be some amount of minute thrombi which are being thrown all over, even in the line that they have. And this is causing the readings. I won't say it is causing 60,000 and 70,000, which we are seeing, but we have 2-3 patients in care itself who have recovered now, who values obviously correlated with the clinical status. But when you have a doubt like this, you just repeat a sample. You just make your admin understand that the cost is not important. Because whatever we charge is definitely much more than the actual costing of the test. So there is no problem if we repeat a sample. At least I have the liberty to get a repeat sample and do it. Many people may not have. And but this is something I think you have to make the administration understand that in one patient, for the cost of one test, we may have to do 3. But this is an inherent problem. Maybe we will know after a few months. One, I still feel is viscous. The viscosity of the sample is due to drugs or to other things which they may be receiving, or to the pathogenesis of the disease itself, which may prove to be true later. And the other thing is maintenance of the instruments was not like what we normally do. It has to be more mandatory of frequent cycles of cleaning the instrument. And this has reduced the large number of repeats we have to do. This is my understanding. If anybody else has a different experience, I don't know.
We too have same experience, madam. Values are very high, very high.
The companies themselves, we have called the engineers, the product specialists, everybody to check. But as you read literature, this is a common feature. And if you look at the sample itself, there is such a gross difference. I already actually called the critical care people to, because they are the ones who are saying, what is this? What is this? I said, you please come and have a look at the sample. I will repeat the sample for you. That is not a problem. But don't say the lab is wrong. This itself is different. And we are fortunate to have 3 platforms.
As this is a new disease, we don't know the pathology.
Yes.
What is happening at a
Yes.
cellular level. But you have mentioned it right.
Yes.
And there is a chance of drug interactions also. That is, and also not just the
Yes.
only COVID medications. Patients are also taking some various other medications for underlying various disorders also. So we don't know drug-drug interactions and all. Maybe, definitely, there may be some problem at the cellular level.
Yes. I hope I've been able to answer your question, ma'am, to a certain extent, if not
Ma'am, yes,
completely.
ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
So thank you, Atika, for that question. And coming back to the discussion of the index case today, I'll come back to Krishna Prasad sir. Sir, when is it that we should refer these patients whom we are suspecting having a procoagulant disorder to a actual hematologist, and what is it that we should not be doing, like ordering some investigations or doing some treatment or something, or make a situation which is too confusing to the hematologist?
You all know the treatment. First thing is complete the treatment and document the recanalization of the area, what is that was affected in the first phase. And then if situation permits, if the condition is permitting us, stop the anticoagulation. give 2 weeks gap, then you investigate the case as a naive case. That is always better. At this moment, when you are giving the patient, giving anticoagulants to the patient, better not to over-investigate. First, complete the treatment. Saving the life is more important than the diagnosis.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. So I'll open up the discussion. I think any questions from the other people? Anup, you can have any other thing to add?
Yeah, Praneeth, I'll ask a question to Dr. Krishna Prasad, and I think this was something which was there in my mind for long. I think we all think we know the answer, but we don't. Sir, when patients come to us with acute arterial thrombosis versus acute venous thrombosis, young guys, I'm just setting the stage, young guys with no obvious vitamin deficiency so that we can take those things out, no predisposing factor, nothing. How should our approach differ between arterial versus venous, particularly if that precise thing, if you could answer? Like, what are the fundamental differences in our approach when we are dealing with arterial versus venous thrombosis in young people?
No, if the thrombotic site is an unusual site, that has to be investigated, because a coronary artery disease and a cerebrovascular accident we see day in and day out many cases. That is the usual site for thrombosis. If the thrombosis is occurring at an unusual site, then definitely that case has to be investigated. We should not leave it. And what the list of conditions what I have mentioned, certain disorders are more towards venous thrombotic venous side, certain disorders are more towards arterial side. Homocysteine, it is more towards an arterial side. And the essential thrombocytosis, that is myeloproliferative neoplasm, that is more towards an arterial side. We have seen many cases of arterial thrombosis in essential thrombocyte. Likewise, we have to go by the clinical story and the family history, clinical story, and our clinical findings, and the baseline investigations like hemogram and coagulation profile. Then we have to put an algorithm and go ahead like that. Otherwise, in the acute setting, whether it is a venous thrombosis or arterial thrombosis, treatment is same. You know the protocols, that is not an issue at all. But getting a pinpointed correct diagnosis is very difficult many times. Many times. We have a series of vascular thrombosis cases, and only probably in less than 50% of the cases we could come to a reasonable conclusion. But rest of the things we manage it like this, and we are managing them also, because we have seen many people having recurrent thrombosis. They didn't permit us to stop the anticoagulation, to work it up completely. That's why it is very difficult. That's why always in the hematology forms what they say is treat. Don't bother about the diagnosis. If it is a life-threatening situation, continue lifelong antibiotic.
Sir, I will share a clinical case with you. That case is ongoing right now. The patient is admitted. Just if you could share your thoughts about your approach towards diagnostics. So this is a young guy who is 3 weeks post-COVID. He had COVID diagnosed early in September, asymptomatic, home quarantine, really didn't need anything else. Now he's admitted with various symptoms. And if you need, I will give you all that clinical story, but I'm just telling you what the thrombotic situation is.
No problem.
On his CT scan, we found that he has got a SMA thrombosis, which is not occlusive. All these are non-occlusive. He has SMA thrombosis. He has got unilateral iliac artery thrombosis. He has got some disease involving one of the carotids. And his left renal accessory artery is completely thrombosed. That's the only artery which is completely thrombosed. It has led to half of his left side kidney infarcted. And there is some suggestion that he may be having some microthrombosis as well, because his troponin is elevated. He had some what we thought was ischemia of the colon, but that was not conclusively proven. We are still in the process of working this up. But cases like these, how would you approach? I can tell you clinically, I am in no hurry to start him on anticoagulation at this time, because there is no organ threatened right now. post-COVID, young guy, no other atherosclerosis. There is no signs of atherosclerosis anywhere. So how would you help us with this?
Prior to this COVID business, patient is all right. No thrombosis event anytime, and nothing was documented.
Yes, he claims he had been absolutely fine, not a single disease, non-hypertensive, nothing. 40 something.
The COVID is a new entity. We don't know 100% what is happening at a tissue level. There are so many inflammatory markers getting raised, and the D-dimers are getting raised. What is happening at the organ level, we don't know. But at this moment, the certain some of the post-mortem studies of these COVID patients are showing they are finding so many thrombosis. The pulmonary thromboembolism is a major event with which the patient died. These are the reports what we are seeing in the post-mortem reports. We don't know. Probably the pathology at a cellular level is different for COVID. We don't know. The patient is having, so you have documented many thrombotic sites in the body, but none of the organs were threatened. Probably one or two, I don't know. You have described many areas. We don't, probably, anyway, whatever it is, if the organ threatening is not there, generally we won't bother much about the investigations further, because I don't know why you have done a portal angiograms. That is because the superior mesenteric vein was partially thrombosed and all those things. All generally in the body, thrombosis and thrombolysis is a phenomena occurring regularly. That's why probably in due course, all these thrombi may be lysed. That's why most of the things what we see is, if there is no problem at all, we'll just wait and watch. Most of the, as per the physiology book, the thrombosis in the vessels will get lysed, but it will take at least 6 months. That's why we don't know. The COVID is something new. We don't know 100% about the pathophysiology, what is happening there. But at this, for this case, if it is really, if there is an indication for anticoagulation, go ahead. If it is not there, just please keep the patient and follow up whether what is happening to the thrombosis. Is it getting lysed in intervals? You see the once again the imagology and the recanalization. And what about what we are doing for vascular thrombosis, sir? We are giving only anticoagulation. What is anticoagulation? It is stopping the further thrombus formation. But what is happening to the area which is already thrombosed? It has to lyse by itself. The body will lyse it, but it will take a long time. Generally, it is for 3 to 6 months for all venous thrombosis. That's why the treatment protocols also, when you have started initially heparin or low marker heparin, whatever it is, then you are shifting on to the oral anticoagulation and continuing for the 3 to 6 months time and reevaluating whether regarding the recanalization of the vessels, whether it is a portal circuit or it is in the cerebral circuit or is it in the deep venous thrombosis of the leg and all those things. If the recanalization has occurred, you can take a decision to stop the anticoagulation. That is the thing. That's why it has to lyse by itself. Probably it will lyse by that side itself. But still, COVID, we don't know what is happening. We have to have a good information in the some studies and data to understand what is happening at a tissue level. Probably that is my understanding.
Thank you, sir. That was my question.
Right, sir. Thank you.
Pranit, on to you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
I think we are already almost 10 minutes out of our scheduled time. So from the audience, do we have any questions or comments regarding today's case or any other thing before we wind up? Okay, so I think if there are no more questions or suggestions, so before we close, I would ask our guest today, sir, starting with you, Krishna sir, how did you feel about this session, and any suggestions to make it better?
It's a very good session, sir. We should have an interaction because we have to involve the laboratory people also. Because madam she's here. Likewise, sometimes it may be microbiologist, sometimes it may be pathologist, sometimes it is a radiologist also in prevention. Because for a better management, a teamwork is always essential. Even sometimes it is some cardiologist, sometimes a gastroenterologist and a hepatologist and a neurologist, depending on the situation of the case. We have to involve all the people and we will have a better inputs into the difficult cases. This is the thing what is being projected in the NEJM, that is problem case solving. So that is the heading. We use it to do it in the Nizam Institute. Thank you for calling me. It is a very nice session. I enjoyed it. Thank you. And after a long time, I am hearing Madam voice. That is another.
And I'm hearing your voice too.
We used to have good interaction when you are in NIMS, Madam. After that, it is very difficult. Okay, Madam. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Madam, comments from your end. How did you feel was the session, and any questions, suggestions from your end?
Thank you, Praneeth. Thank you, Rahul. I am very happy that you invited me, and I was able to air many things which I have been feeling. And like Dr. Krishna Prasad said, we still don't know what is happening in COVID. Every day is a learning period. I just want to say something. This thrombosis episodes post-COVID is becoming more common. This evening, we got a patient, a father and son, 66-year-old man, who says, my father is free of COVID, but you tell me why his D-dimers in every hospital are 1300, 1500, 1600. Now you tell me. I said, I have no answer. I have been discussing with Dr. Guru Prasad in detail, and he feels these patients will develop APLA in some form, secondary APLA. And maybe we have looked at 3 patients, and 2 of them have been positive for APLA, and ANA profiles all negative. So are we looking at secondary APLAs in these patients is something we have to see. And I would be interested to know from Anup, what was the D-dimer level in this patient which you mentioned? And is it changing from day to day? Maybe we can discuss it in the hospital, but thank you once again. And thank you everybody for coming to this session. I hope we have many more.
Thank you so much. I think Anup, you need to discuss this case in detail with Dr. Shanti. So Anup, before we conclude, your final closing remarks.
Yeah, I think that this whole multidisciplinary, or what I would call as leaving our comfort zone and talking to people, somehow I think conversation is lost in our, or not lost, but it is certainly and gone down in our decision. And multidisciplinary discussion doesn't have to be in an auditorium. It can be in the hallway, it can be in the laboratory, it can be in the cath lab, OPDs, or these huddle kind of session. And I think today's session was a classic example of that, where we had somebody from the lab, we had somebody who's an expert in the session, and then people like us who kind of see these cases at the first time. So one of the theme from the discussion today is, rather than working in silos, we need to step out, talk to people, get some more information. And sessions like today increases or improves our thought process. So I thank Dr. Krishna Prasad, I thank Dr. Shanti for coming with us. And hopefully we'll be able to continue this discussion on a more formal platform. It was pretty good today.
So
sometime down the line, please do renin-aldosterone. Praneeth, sometime down the line, please do renin-aldosterone.
Sure, ma'am. Sure. I will be bothering you about this case. Anyway, so thank you for the inputs. Thank you, Krishna sir, once again. Thank you, Shanti Naidu madam, and thank you all for joining our session. I would close the session, and good evening to one and all. Thank you.
So Praneeth, just before everybody leaves, I'll just say these last comments. The weekly huddle happens every Wednesday at 7:30. This is our 20th session. We are going to keep doing it till there is a reason why we don't do it. The format is an audio interaction like this. We always start at 7:30. The ID and the password you have or the link you have, they work for every future session. So if you need to log in and if you don't have an invite next Wednesday, you can simply just click onto that link and you will reach up here. All the sessions are recorded. So if you need to hear this, or if any of your friends want to hear to this, you can just email it to me. I'll be able to share you the recording. Also, I'm uploading all the recording on podcast. The podcast name is the Weekly Huddle, from where you can listen it to your phones and also download it on your computer. So that is the overall journey of how we are doing Weekly Huddle. And if you have any suggestion to improve it, please let us know, because we want it to be as good as what we can. Thank you all, and good night to everybody. Thanks, Praneeth, for hosting this. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all. Good
Thank you,
night.
Pranit. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.